last 3 years of history that we've endured, the term pandemic is something that stirs up a lot of emotion, a lot of memory for us. I personally remember going to a Walmart in March of 2020 and just noticing all the empty aisles and just all the shelves like empty of groceries because people just panic bought as many things as possible. But pandemic meant something a little different back in the 14th century. In the 14th century, they experienced something called the Black Death, which is still to this day considered the most fatal pandemic that humanity has ever experienced. There were projections of 75 to 200 million fatalities, all within a period of 5 to 6 years. Started around the east and moved west, hitting parts of Europe and eventually England. The Black Death, also called the bubonic plague, was not a generally pleasant experience to have. Typically started with a fever, usually between 100 and 105 degrees. 105 degrees, that's
too hot.
That's a hot fever. Would also involve a headache, joint pain, nausea, fatigue. So that sounds like a flu, not too bad. That'd roughly be followed by the formation of buboes, which are inflamed lumps that would form on your groin, on your armpit, or on your neck that were filled with pus and would sometimes kind of erupt. And they were typically the size of, I think, like a golf ball up to like an apple in size. Extremely painful, as you could imagine. And that would be followed by an extremely acute fever and the vomiting of blood. And if you weren't able to recover from there, the next symptom would be death itself. Most victims would die between 2 and 8 days of experiencing their first symptoms. Imagine the life of just being a healthy person, knowing that you were about 8 days away from a painful, miserable death. That's a rough thing to experience. People say that around 45 to up to 60% of the entire European population died during this period. And the year that the Black Plague made its way to England was 1348, which would have been the year that our subject for today, Julian of Norwich, would have turned 6 years old. There's something interesting about the history that doesn't just happen while we're alive, but the history that we inherit. It's something that we have no control over whatsoever. Imagine turning 6 years old on the year that the most fatal pandemic that would bring about horrible, violent death to half the population showed up at the door of your country. Imagine how that would shape you and your life, mental well-being, emotional state, and let alone a possible spiritual relationship with God. Those are the questions we're going to talk about today. So, hey everybody. Welcome to Church History for Chumps. My name is John Simon.
And I'm Thomas Dewell.
Whoa. Lightning fast on the draw there, my friend.
Yeah, you've been critiquing me.
Only. There's usually like a beat. There's like a little beat between, which I think people are listening to and they're like, oh, did my audio cut out? But yeah, they won't think that this time.
No.
They sure won't.
No. We're here.
Yeah, we're here. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to share this, but this is a re-recorded episode, which feels weird. So, as you guys know, we are a podcast that takes place in the desert. Our office building was struggling with being AC-less for a while, and we recorded a full episode on Julian. I think it was a banger. At least it was like a subtle banger. And
like an 8.5?
Yeah, I was thinking 8.1 maybe.
Okay.
Apparently, it was so hot, not just our content but the temperature, that the audio file failed, and there's nothing we could do with it. So we were like, well, we could just leave Julian in the darkness, or we could give it another try.
No. And we have one listener in particular who was really lamenting the loss of the Julian pod. So
And we couldn't do that to her.
No, we gotta bring it back.
That's right.
And today it is crisp and cool.
Oh my gosh.
In the office.
Yeah.
And it's feeling nice.
You know, I feel like I'm on the English coast right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, assuming.
Not quite.
I don't really know much about England.
There's a rug hanging up behind John right now, blocking the burning orb of hate from shining into
That's
the
fair.
room that we're in.
I feel like the English coast right now, if the English coast was like an island that sat above hell.
Yes. Hey,
But
you
yeah.
mentioned something that I thought was really interesting that may be a good interlude, but the idea of being like really young as something really world kind of shaking is going on, how that would affect you. That made me think, so my great-grandma Davis was born in 1919.
Okay.
And she was really, really young during the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
And that shaped her whole life from there. Like I
Yeah.
just found out the other day, like we were opening presents at some family gathering, and my Nana told me that she used to take the like the tissue paper, you know, that you put in presents. She would iron that after it had been used and save it, because that was just what you did if you lived through the Depression era, that Depression mindset.
Yeah.
And from what I remember, which I knew nothing about Julian before we recorded this the first time, but I think that growing up in this setting really shaped her.
Oh yeah. Well, so let's get a little bit of background in. So Julian is a very interesting figure because as much as she's beloved, she's also shrouded in mystery, and that's really just because at this point in history, there weren't many women who wrote. Like Julian's actually considered the first English female author to have like widely distributed published works. So even and that's not like a Christian author or like religious author, just like first like English author who was a woman in general.
Wow.
But the interesting thing about Julian was that she did not come from a background of wealth. At least it's not believed so. Like people don't know if her name was actually Julian. And I learned this in between our first and this episode, that people called her Julian because the like cell where she served as a hermit was outside of a church that was called St. Julian's. So they don't so that's most likely almost
Probably
definitely not her name.
Wow.
Yeah. But she was a woman who at the age of 30 committed herself to a life as an anchoress. And an anchoress is essentially a hermit who lives in a very small room with usually a single window that faces outside. And within this room, that's usually like jail cell size. Like it's not the room that we're in right now, you know, there's some desks and, you know, little chairs and stuff. Like, this is a pretty wide room. It would probably be about a third of this room, I would imagine. And the practice of being an anchoress or an anchorite, if you're a man, was essentially, it was the life of a monk. It was a life of isolation. It was a life that was meant to be firmly committed to prayer and meditation, and really like all you're meditating on is just God himself.
Do you know, did an anchoress, did they ever leave that cell, or was it like they were committing to like literally being in there all the time?
So I could be corrected here. So hey, shoot us an email if I'm off. But I believe you stayed there for the most part, because the interesting turning point in Julian's life was she would basically have a near-death experience. She would get very, very sick, which could have been a version of the plague, which at this point in her life was not nearly as prevalent as it was in her childhood, but she got sick and nearly died. And I believe that her experiences, like, she didn't leave her cell. Like, she would have priests who would administer her the sacrament and who would pray over her. But I believe they did so through that window, but I don't think she left.
Okay.
I won't say that she stayed there until she died, because I haven't seen anything that reported that, but she you were pretty much there for the long haul.
I think anchoress is like one of the coolest titles in the church history.
It's got some punch to it. Oh yeah,
anchoress.
So in a part of Julian's life, she basically had three deep longings, and the longings were that she wanted to experience the passion of Jesus, which of course was his crucifixion. She wanted to experience a near death or actual death bringing illness, and she wanted to be afflicted with three wounds, and they were the wounds of contrition, of compassion, and of an insatiable longing for Jesus. And again, so she, the first of these was brought to pass. You're gonna say something.
I just have to say, if you heard that and you're looking up at your little stupid vision board in your office right now, and you see that new Jeep on there or whatever, tear that down and throw it in the trash.
That's right. Yeah, it's time to start setting some better New Year's resolutions. Yeah,
life-threatening illness.
And if you're curious about that, we'll try to unpack the historical context of that too. But so essentially, like I said, at the age of 30, she had this like terrible sickness where she believed she would die. And then it was at that point when she started having visions. And these visions were oftentimes like very religious. They often had biblical kind of like symbology. Like there was a time where a priest who was administering the Eucharist to her was holding a crucifix, and she saw like the face of Jesus like animated, and she saw like dried blood appear across his face. And she had a really deep longing and connection with the passion of Jesus. So this was like, but each of these visions that she would experience over this time period, they all had kind of this significance where she felt like they were always like almost these divine messages communicating something really significant to her. And oftentimes they were deeply biblical truths. They weren't things like, Jesus is going to come back in 100 years. Like it wasn't something like meant to be prophetical. It was God kind of revealing a part of himself to her, but through these like really vivid visions. And so she would go on to write these visions down in, of course, her most well-known work, which is Revelations of Divine Love, which she would revisit later on in life, and she would basically expand a lot of, she would basically go on to interpret a lot of the visions that she had, and kind of wrote like a longer version of the shorter text that she had. But interestingly, what a lot of her writings always come back to is just this deep, rich, incredible love of God. And it's not just a deep love that she had for God, but she felt like God was consistently and continually appearing before her to share this like tremendous love that he had for humanity. And it was a love that like changed her view on suffering. She saw suffering not as an absence of God's love, but a way that God was choosing to deepen our relationship with his love. She saw sin as like essentially something that was kind of an attack on God's love, but it was almost like we struggle with sin, this horrible thing that God will eventually fully remove from us, and even sin just makes us recognize that we're drawn to something that isn't good, so now we need to be drawn more to his love instead. So everything is just kind of like pulled down by this gravity of love from Julian. And the interesting thing about this is that like we hear this today and we're like, yeah, dude, like every K-Love song is like, Jesus is my boyfriend. Like God loves you is not a strange notion today. But historically for them, it really was, because this is the 1300s, and historically the the early church for about 1,000 years was operating out of an understanding of Jesus's sacrifice and victory over death through the lens of Christus Victor, which is this idea that Jesus beat the powers of Satan. He destroyed the powers of evil on the cross and through his resurrection. And as a result, he stands as this like divine, victorious champion over the universe.
Which is not a wrong view.
No, it's beautiful.
Right.
It's a fantastic view. The interesting thing that comes from placing that much emphasis was that it made humans more or less the spoils of war. Like, humans were a consequence of Jesus's victory over death, but they weren't a pursuit. Jesus wasn't pursuing the lost, and if he was, it was a back burner motivation.
I think another dimension that adds to this feeling and understanding of who Jesus is at this time during the Middle Ages is the church had always had a fascination with Rome and had patterned so much of, I would not say their ecclesiology itself, but some of the trappings of the church after the Roman way.
Yeah.
And so Jesus, as the head of the church, is in the mind of many a Christian through the medieval period seen as this like an emperor.
Yeah,
light.
I was just, yep.
He's very distant.
He is the divine. Yeah, he is. So that was the emperor of Roman times. He was divine, and he was far removed from the common man. And I think that the good part of that is Jesus is the King of Kings. He is far removed, but the beauty of his love is that the King of Kings would descend and dwell amongst the common and suffer on their behalf.
Yeah.
And this idea of suffering really comes about with the figure of Saint Anselm, who's probably another dude who's worth a full episode, because Saint Anselm introduced probably the first theory of atonement that didn't disagree with Christus Victor, but it added a different emphasis to it. And this was the ransom theory, which placed more emphasis on not Jesus being the victor and the triumphant one, but as the one who suffered. Because then all of a sudden you have human beings in the medieval time period who are, especially when you think about the bubonic plague, they are very familiar with suffering. They are very familiar with the weight of sin upon the world. And so now Jesus is not just seen as this triumphant victor, he's seen as the ransom for sin, the one who received punishment and death on our behalf. And now human beings aren't just a side effect of Jesus's victory, but that Jesus like sought us out. And then you have a dude like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who I freaking love, who says something like, Jesus sought to recapture the affections of carnal men. Like Jesus did what he did because he saw that the love of broken humans was set on artificial things, and his sacrifice was to reorient humans to loving that which gave life, which is the divine. And so
you're right, to us, I think in a broader, maybe evangelical culture, it doesn't sound that crazy to say something like that,
right?
But to them, this would have been like maybe even borderline like progressive heresy,
totally
like playing with fire to talk about God in that way. Yeah.
And then so you have Julian, who, you know, and like I said, dude, like I can't imagine, like I'll confess, if I get a cold, I'm immediately like, all right, what did I do that God is like, like what is God trying to shake me free of right now? But honestly, it's not God is trying to get me back on track. It's usually God is smacking my wrist with a ruler by making me sick. Like whenever I get sick, I struggle with that, which is bad. Like I'm seeing God as not a loving disciplinarian, but as a cruel and vindictive figure. And so if I freaking got the bubonic plague, And then imagine it's not just me, but it's half the people in Tucson are just all miserably dying of this thing. Like, it's natural to think maybe God hates us. Like, maybe God is just like smashing us with a rock because we're just worms in his sight. And then someone like Julian, who experienced the bubonic plague personally from the ages of like 6 to 12, which pretty formative years there. And she has these incredible visions where God makes it very clear, no, like, my relationship to you and to your people is one of like deep love and care. Like, there's one that what is also a really famous vision of hers, which is that she had a vision of a hazelnut or something that looked like a hazelnut. And she saw it kind of like sitting in the palm of whoever she could imagine God was. Like, she saw a hazelnut in a hand, and she was like, that is like, God is holding that. And it became very clear to her in her mind, just through this vision and whatever else she was experiencing, that like 3 things were true. That this thing that God had, he made, that he cared for, and that he was going to keep it completely. And she saw like creation as that hazelnut. She saw the people of God as that little hazelnut, as like this tiny little tender, piece of nature in the hand of God that he just, had so much longing and care for. And I can just imagine how beautiful an experience like that would be, and how formative it would be to a culture that was ravaged with illness and despair for years, in a way that would probably take generations to, even on a cultural level, heal from. Like, I can't imagine how long it would take Tucson to repair if 500,000 people died over the span of 4 years. Like, I can't imagine that. So literally, death is like a figurative and literal cloud hanging over your nation, and God is just there to be like, hey, just remember, like, I deeply care for you and for my people, and this is not something I have ignored. Like, this is a thing I'm coming to heal in due time.
This sounds like, now I don't know enough about Julian, maybe you do, to know kind of what her connection or practice when it came to Mary, the mother of God, is. But I know that it was at this time that the Marian devotion really kicked into high gear. Yeah. Because the Black Plague just really had people in a spot where they were suffering a lot, and they needed tender care, and they just couldn't envision Christ that way. And so Mary becomes this focus of prayer and devotion as a means to getting to Christ, but that maternal quality they really were seeking. And to me, it's interesting. It seems almost countercultural then for her time that Julian is taking the time to think about how Christ actually is bringing that comfort and that care and that love. Again, sounds fairly standard, I think, for us today, but that would have been actually fairly countercultural, even in another way, because I think the more popular way to kind of scratch that itch or check that box at this time was to look to Mary. Yeah, and the interesting thing is, Julian, at least from my understanding, she didn't talk much about Mary, but she did speak a lot of Jesus in very maternal phrasing. Like, she did refer to Jesus as having like a motherly care over the people. And again, like, she had inherited a medieval culture that viewed God comfortably as a father figure, but they also culturally saw fathers as disciplinarians, as judges, as the rigid, kind of heavy-handed ones. And they didn't have a place for a maternal, feminine love to apply to God. Right. And so her view
was essentially to give, like, to attribute that kind of love and that kind of affection towards Christ. But I think over time, and interestingly, the dude I mentioned before, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, he would actually really influence Marian theology in seeing Mary as the mother of God who is constantly interceding for us, whereas I think Julian was content to see Christ as that figure. Like I shared that back in medieval time, they believed that when a mother was breastfeeding or like nursing her infant, that breast milk was just repurposed blood. I guess that was just their understanding of the science. Not that I could prove them wrong, 'cause I don't freaking know. but Julian actually made that connection and said, like, literally, just as a mother nurses their infant, Christ is feeding us with his blood at the Eucharist.
Wow.
That's
really cool.
Which is really interesting, right? So yeah, Julian was very, I mean, and like there are parts of Julian's readings that I'm just like, this is weird. I don't want to call Jesus like my mother or my mom, because he's a dude, and I get all these antsy feelings. But you also think, like, beyond all of that, there is such a deep need for the Christian believer to see the love of God in a broader sense, like not in a way where we're like changing what God has said about himself, but in a way where we are not applying only our cultural views of how we see God. Like, I think it is important to see God as a defender, as a champion, as a victor, as someone who is strong and powerful and who provides. But also, I think that we should see God as someone who is intimate and affectionate and caring and loving in a very like gentle, at times bold kind of way. And I think that the Christians in this time period recognize that, and I do think it's a bummer that I think Marian theology did kind of throw them into a tailspin. But yeah.
We've talked about that a lot on this
podcast. We have. Yeah. If you want to hear more, listen to the Maximilian Kolbe episode. But yeah, so that's nice. Our girl Julian.
Yeah. Thanks for all the work you did on that. That was definitely someone, when we first recorded this, I walked into it not knowing anything, which we've kind of been doing that. We've been doing like, I record one that maybe I've done a little bit more work on, and it makes our conversation a little bit more natural and a little bit more of an actual learning environment. And you asked me if you had to guess, Julian, is that a boy's name or a girl's name? I was like, sounds like a dude. And
like, and I was like, wrong. Yeah,
so
that was fun. That's one thing I missed from the original recording.
Important woman in history as a just standing out, definitely, with her contributions to the written language of English, and then also in church history. I think I'm always interested in learning more about how people were formed to be able to be countercultural even within the church, not just countercultural against the world, but countercultural against the tides of their time theologically, where they actually remain biblical in the face of some unbiblical reductions. And sounds like she was one of those people. And I would, without knowing more about her, I would say her association and acquaintance with suffering has to be a big part of that answer.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you're so right. Like, there is, I mean, and this is one of those things that makes me just believe in the goodness of God that much more, because it's like, under so many circumstances, the church could have just turned left and then just gone completely off the rails. And now we're in because I'll talk about the Mormons for a second. That's what Mormons believe. Like, Mormons believe that basically as soon as the apostles just hit the dirt and died, that the church just spun out left, never got back on track, and it took some angel in New Hampshire to bring everything back where it's supposed to be, which is wild. But I mean, I think the beauty of it is, like, God is sovereignly working within his church to like correct course on so many different occasions. And like we see it in the Reformation, which I think is beautiful. We also see individual accounts of it, like someone like Bonhoeffer, who, you know, was an amazing voice of the historic faith, while the German Christians around him had traded it for the nationalist faith. Like there's so many beautiful stories of, like you said, not just cultural counterculture, but like counterculture within a church that has started to go left. And to me, I'm just like, that's just God being amazing. That's just God preserving the words of Jesus, that the gates of hell will not, you know, shake this foundation, will not topple this rock that he's built. Yep. So yeah, that's so cool. It's such a blessing.
Sweet. Well, good pod.
Yeah, I think we can. That was a little bite-sized one, but I like it. Yeah, I'm cool with that.
Absolutely.
Well, hey everybody, thank you so much for listening. It's been a great time. We hope that you've been encouraged by the words of Julian. And matter of fact, I'm gonna close us out with one of her favorite quotes. And I want to send this to anyone who is feeling especially discouraged or facing suffering, disease, either personally or through someone who you love. Just the simple words of Julian, who had seen and experienced all types of death, disease, and misery. And she simply said, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." So Go in peace, and I will, and we'll see you next time.
Later.